So, welcome back to Silmarillion Total War and to another battle replay, and this is going to be filling one of the optional midweek slots that is now present in my schedule, because it's going to be a smaller scale battle than the Silmarillion one we saw. I think it would be exactly last week from now, where that was a large scale siege battle, showcasing the fact that they have now got the engine overhaul, and there's also been a few changes with the factions and some of the visual elements. This is going to be kind of an expansion on that idea, because once again we're going to be seeing one half of what used to be the Easterling faction in the House of Ulfang take on a very harsh task indeed, as they are going to be going up against the Blessed Realm of Valinor, the most quality-centric faction that the game has to offer, with many scary units at their disposal, whereas Ulfang, of course, a little bit more, I'd say, challenging to play, just based on the fact that they are a lighter faction in general, and some of their units like shock infantry and that sort of thing, they can be a little bit more risky and hazardous to use, I suppose. But anyway, this is, I believe, the lake bed or a map along those lines, because we have seen this map in the past, albeit it does look a little bit different. The engine overhaul in general, I think, has changed things up a little bit visually. There's something different about it. I'm not entirely sure what, but something seems different in comparison to what it used to look like, and indeed what Reforged looks like. But yeah, anyway. That's just that's by the by, really. But this was another one sent to me by a leech who has been one of him and Balagost have really been the primary contributors of replays of Silmarillion over the course of the past half year or so. Anyway, the House of Ulfang. So as we've mentioned, they are quite damage-centric. Certainly in terms of survivability, they're going to be up against it against Valinor, but then pretty much every faction is going to be at a fairly substantial disadvantage there, outside of maybe the Dwarves, a couple of the other High Elven factions, maybe Angband, if you fold in their numbers to that as well, but not the sort of thing that Ulfang are going to be able to rely upon. They're going to have to pick and choose their engagements very carefully, because they are ultimately going to need to be aggressive to some extent as well to make full use of some of their more damaging units of infantry. The Thanes of Ulfang here, of course, an axe and shield unit, decent at dealing damage. They will actually be fairly good at the entry level, at facing the entry level Teleri units that Valinor do traffic in, but as soon as they get into the higher tier units, they're going to need to either completely overwhelm as part of a combined force, or they are going to be in a substantial amount of trouble. Just in behind, the Marauders of Himring. I mean, throwing projectiles, Ulfang should have a greater variety of them. If there's one thing that Valinor doesn't have at their disposal, it's a huge roster of units. While many of their units are individually very impressive, they don't have maybe the variety that some other factions do. The Marauders of Himring throwing axes as well will be very useful at dealing with some of the really scary high-end units that Valinor have that are unshielded. In particular, I'll be looking at the Plaza Guardians there. Throwing axes will be fairly ideal for dealing with that kind of situation. Just in behind, we also have the Hroatani Foragers, so again, javelins, more throwing projectiles, going to be absolutely vital if Ulfang are to be successful in any capacity here, though of course, while Valinor only really have access to a couple of ranged units, both of which are lower end Teleri by Valinor standards, they will still be able to do plenty of damage to a unit as lightweight as the Hroatani here, so it'll be interesting to see how that works out in the long run. Two forces on the flanks, the Ravagers of Himring. I mean, again, the lowest tier of Falx unit they have. I mean, they are still going to be pretty good off the charge for the tier of unit that they are, but also very vulnerable to range projectiles, and also their melee defense, once their charge is worn off and their damage and such, they will be outpaced. So again, timing is going to be everything here with the Ravagers. If they can be used at the correct time, they could punch well above their weight. If they aren't, they will be fairly disappointing against the level of opponents they've been tasked with facing here. Just in behind, we also have the mounted version of the Himring Axe, those that we've already seen, the Pillagers of Himring. Cavalry for Valinor is split really between their Horse Archers, which will do very well against the Pillagers, I think, and their high-end melee Knights, which, if the Pillagers can be microed effectively, could actually be the ideal answer to them. But of course, the risk is very real, but then the risk is clear when you're playing as Ulfang against a force this quality-centric. The Despoilers of Dor Caranthia are here as well, a more powerful Falx unit, and indeed, I think generally speaking, they will be a scarier unit for Valinor to try and look after, I suppose. The Teleri in particular will not do too well against the Despoilers, but again, the higher tier units, this is where Ulfang will tend to struggle a little bit, one-to-one, so they're going to have to rely on numbers and try and combine the damage that Falxmen have with a little bit of range support as well from javelins and throwing axes if they are to be successful against some of the high elven units at Valinor's top end, but we shall see. But yeah, several units of despoilers, so a pretty chunky force there. One unit, to be fair, that Valinor won't be too pleased to see is the Sons of Ulfang, the strongest unit of infantry that the House of Ulfang have, and that's because not only do they have the charge bonus and damage of the despoilers in front of them, but individually speaking they are a little bit stronger, and they also come with native armor piercing, so they will actually be able to inflict the kind of damage values that will worry some of the high-end Valinor units, though the melee defense and the overall survivability of them still lacks individually 1-to-1 against a lot of the high-end Valinor units, so the Sons of Ulfang will still need support around them, but at the very least they will be a little bit more eye-catching when they can get into melee. A couple of units of the Raiders of Dor Caranthia, so a lighter unit of cavalry, shock cavalry mind you, with those spears, and then also they do have those falxes on their back, so it'll be interesting to see how they perform, but again, this is exactly the kind of unit which is going to need to be kept moving. A few good charges, however, into the high-end Valinor units is exactly where the Raiders could prove to be very, very potent indeed. And one unit at the back we have are the Fangs of the Faithless, the only unit of foot archers that Ulfang have on the field today. To be fair, trading back and forth against the lighter Teleri archers, again 1-to-1, will actually be fairly favourable for Ulfang, but again you can't really bring too many of the Fangs of the Faithless to the field. And while they are fairly chunky and fairly tanky, their melee prowess is not maybe as high as you would expect. They can look after themselves defensively, but they're not going to be the answer if you need to do a little bit of damage to see yourself over the line. Now then, moving on, Valinor, probably going to have a smaller army than Ulfang, I would say almost definitely in fact, but obviously we've already mentioned how strong their quality can be. It's not necessarily something which is going to see them over the line all the time. You do need to be careful. A smaller army, as we've seen several times over the years, can be outmaneuvered and overall surrounded, especially on a field like this. But let's see if Batu can make it work for him. The Shoal Runners of Alqualonde, one of the two archer units that Valinor have. This one, of course, is the horseback variant, and as I've already mentioned, against the kind of cavalry units that Ulfang have, as long as they can keep them at arm's length, the damage that elven archers like this can do should be pretty damn good against the kind of forces they're facing off against today. Moving a little bit further back, more of the Teleri units here. We have the Swan Guard of Alqualonde. This really is the unit of, well, not line infantry, but spears that you can mass up and form a fairly numerous front line as Valinor. The Swan Guard, though, as spears, do have that spear malice working against them. Overall, they are more designed to be more of a numerous auxiliary unit so that you can pad your line out and intersperse quality throughout it. Against Ulfang, I'm not sure though. Ulfang's overall defensive stats means that the Swan Guard should still be able to do a fair amount of damage, although a charge from something like the Despoilers or the Sons of Ulfang, or a few volleys from like throwing axes or javelins, are going to do huge damage to them. Here we have the other unit of Valinor cavalry, the Knights of Tyrion, the sword and shield cavalry. As already mentioned, the mounted throwing axe cavalry could be a real problem for them if they get kited around the field. Outside of that though, when it comes to being in pure melee, obviously they're going to be far in excess individually of anything that Ulfang can bring to the table, but fairly small as a unit goes, and obviously very expensive. Speaking of which, a couple of units of the Sentinels of Tyrion. Now they will be worried a little bit by the throwing projectiles that Ulfang have, but again, when it comes to pure melee, as much as the Falxmen are dangerous, the Sentinels of Tyrion are much more well-rounded as a unit. They are small, but the damage they can do is very substantial, and the lower melee defense on some of the Ulfang units is really not going to stand them in good stead against the Sentinels of Tyrion if they are not backed up. So the key to this battle is really rather simple for Ulfang. They need to support their units, and they need to effectively work in pairs or trios almost, because if they get isolated one-to-one in too many of those kinds of fights, Valinor are going to eat them up. Sentries of Alqualonde are the foot-based archers. We've already mentioned how, Valinor are going to have more archers on the field purely because Ulfang only have one, and while they are more well-tooled for skirmishing, I think the way that Valinor have set the stall out here makes things clear with regards to what they're going to be doing. Mariners of Alqualonde, javelins, combined with being more Teleri auxiliaries in melee. Again, it allows them to contest that javelin fight. I think it's less important for Valinor to win that, but they still need to be able to contest that with Ulfang so that their infantry can go about its business. Plaza Guardians are here in the middle. This is something that Ulfang don't have access to, which is the Phalanx unit. Not only that, but the Plaza Guardians do have access to armor piercing as well, which admittedly is not the most important thing against Ulfang. but still, it will still add a little bit of extra damage onto the end of what they're already doing. The Plaza Guardians, of course, make that central lane much more solid. Shoal Hunters, so a unit of slingers, another example of a throwing projectile. In all fairness, there are no slingers on display for Ulfang today, and we've seen slingers be very effective before, and the Shoal Hunters, I think, are really useful for Valinor in that regard, because it allows you to support your unit pretty close by with some consistent, small but armor-piercing damage. Again, we'll see how effective they are against a lighter faction like Ulfang here. We do have some more Knights of Tyrion, more Sentinels of Tyrion, as well as the Grieving Sons, which are another unit of heavy swordsmen, albeit these are Teleri, and they're a little bit less likely, or a little bit less armoured, but maybe a little bit more affordable as well, and the added numbers will actually be fairly useful here. Not the sort of thing that the Ravagers of Himring over on this side of the field will want to see one-to-one either, but that really is the overall theme here, isn't it? Sentries of Alqualonde, more Mariners of Alqualonde, and finally another unit of the Sentries of Alqualonde as well. Interesting to not see the Hearthguard of Tyrion, the shielded unit, because they do mitigate quite a few of the strengths that Ulfang can bring to bear with regards to throwing projectiles, but going for the extra damage on the Sentinels does allow them to really put pressure on the Ulfang melee defense, I suspect. But without further ado, let's get this show on the road, shall we? So based upon Ulfang's performance in the last battle replay we saw in the Siege, I would imagine we're going to see at least the opening phases play out in rather the same way, where we're going to see Valinor kind of dominate at long range, but as the battle then enters later stages, the supporting units from Ulfang will really come into play. Now, this is perhaps a slightly stiffer challenge of these credentials than we saw last time around, because they cannot rely on fortifications to do a lot of the heavy lifting for them and funnel the enemy into their axe throwers and their javelins. Having said that though, Valinor's lower numbers do mean that if you can get those units into position, you should be able to do some fairly critical damage pretty quickly if you're the Ulfang player here. And even though some of these units are not the heaviest in the world, they are still shielded, so the amount of damage the Shoal Runners are going to be able to do will be mitigated. And of course the damage dealing potential of those Falksmen is still going to be one of the more important things. And you can see here that Ulfang are sort of splitting their army off into 3 distinct groups, and they're going to be advancing forward like so. Now, I think this is the best thing for Valinor to be doing as well, targeting down these unshielded and very lightly armoured Falksmen. Over on this flank you're going to get far more efficient performances from these kind of units. Pillagers of Himring will move forwards and try and act as a blocker unit. You need to be very careful of those Knights of Tyrion as well, of course. As we take a look throughout the rest of the battle, and indeed there is going to be an engagement over here as well from the Knights of Tyrion, charging in. Of course, when you've got this amount of units to try and control as you cross the battlefield, things can get a little bit unwieldy for you, and this is where, if you're the one taking the initiative, the enemy can then react to you a little bit more accordingly, and that's what we're seeing here from the Knights of Tyrion, getting a nice charge into the Marauders. Having said that, the Rohirrim Foragers are right in behind. None of the riders fell, of course, because of the very heavy armour and the multiple HP nature of many of Valinor's high-end units. Actually, no, one of the riders did fall. 2, in fact. Not easy to accomplish. Those Raiders of Dor Caranthia as well, I think, are going to be a very important unit. I mean, it's over on this side of the battlefield, actually, where Ulfang are at their most dangerous, with the Sons of Ulfang surrounded by this also impressive despoilers. And they've got those cavalry units as well. So as much as I do agree with the Shoal Runners attempting to focus down a unit like this, you could make the argument for saying that maybe the Horse Archers should have gone over to the other side of the battlefield, because you would certainly back Valinor to be able to overpower a unit like the Ravagers in melee without needing extra support, whereas the Sons of Ulfang and the Despoilers will be a little bit more worrisome, shall we say, as the Shoal Runners continue to fire. Swan Guard in the middle, and then there's also the small matter of the sentries out back. So I think this is really going to come down to if Ulfang can continue to withstand this level of damage over an extended period. Pillagers of Himring moving forwards as well, although they too are starting to take a fair amount of damage. I suppose if their whole purpose for being is to simply try and deliver as many of the infantry units to the front line as possible, that's all well and good, but they are not going to last too long in melee against something like the Knights of Tyrion, you would suggest. Ravager's also going berserk. I mean, this is we haven't really seen... Again, I think this is just a more obvious example of the impetuous trait. You can see, however, that with that charge, it is enough to actually cause a fair amount of distress to those Knights of Tyrion, and of course the Falksmen, as we've mentioned, tend to be pretty good at dealing with cavalry and melee as well, so that hasn't gone too well actually for the Valinor cavalry there. They may very well have managed to force the Pillagers of Himring off this position, but you'd have to say that that was something that certainly went in favour of the Ravagers there. Maybe I am guilty of underestimating the more basic units here, especially considering the level of opposition that they're going up against. This will probably not go as well for them, however, as much as they did manage to land some decisive blows on the mounted version of this unit. The Sentinels of Tyrion in sustained melee should be far too strong for the Ravagers, the Grieving Sons as well. So an example of a unit maybe getting a bit too far ahead of itself there. There's also this small section in the middle, Plaza Guardians backing up the Swan Guard of Alqualonde. I mean, the Plaza Guardians, if they can maintain their formation, that's not really a huge amount Ulfang are going to be able to do in melee, I don't think. The Thanes, I mean, they'll be pretty good, I suppose, against the Swan Guard, I think, the Thanes, but maybe not so much against the Plaza Guardians. We can see as well the Slingers offering their support, so those Shoal Hunters, as we mentioned at the start, this is really the one form of throwing projectile that Ulfang do not have in comparison to Valinor, and already trying to take advantage of them. Maybe not the best of angles for the Shoal Hunters, but still doing their thing. Taking a look over there, those more elite shock infantry units of Ulfang still haven't made their way into the enemy units over on the other side. Meanwhile, the Grieving Sons, victory seems certain for them. Another unit of the Ravagers is on the way, and they will get the charge. As I keep mentioning, for the Falksmen the charge is extremely important, and they will be able to inflict a fair amount of damage as a result of that. But this unit as well, Ravagers, very isolated. They did manage to get into the sentries in melee actually, but I think it's just a case of pure numbers here that they're going to be overwhelmed. And over on this side of things, Sons of Ulfang, Despoilers of Dorcaranthia, still trying to chase down the enemy, really. And this is another example of the ranged units for Valinor being used pretty effectively. I mean, javelins and slinger projectiles, they are chasing down the sentries. They may catch up to them, but the amount of damage they're taking as a result of this is very substantial. I'm actually kind of surprised, though, that the Sons of Ulfang have been left largely alone. They are, after all, the most dangerous of Ulfang's infantry units. Despoilers going toe-to-toe with the Sentinels of Tyrion, and numbers-wise, actually, especially with the Sons of Ulfang arriving, this will actually slowly tick over into being a situation that looks like being a victory for Ulfang. Again, another unit of these Sentinels, though. Marauders in melee will stand absolutely no chance whatsoever against this calibre of fighter. That's an interesting loss. The loss of the Valinor general this early, of course, among many of these factions, but you can see that the loss of the general does have an impact, and they were getting utterly overwhelmed here, and the arrival of the Sons of Ulfang certainly not helping matters there. But I suppose if there was a faction that was going to be able to withstand the loss of a general, it would be Valinor, but the initial effects here are looking pretty bleak, actually. And if the Sentinels of Tyrion couldn't hold the line, then the Shoal Hunters and the Mariners of Alqualonde are not going to be able to do so either. This is the problem with having so many of your units be ranged, and the necessity to use them at range first and foremost as the Despoilers lurch forwards. Two units of them as well, and they are going to be able to catch up to the Mariners, preventing those javelins from being utilised, and so far the numbers heavy approach has helped Ulfang. And you can see here the problem is the Plaza Guardians not able to get themselves into an organised formation, so the Thanes are in and amongst them, taking away a lot of the effectiveness of what a phalanx can be. Javelins also being used to good effect here. The Rohatani Foragers, Fangs of the Faithless also trying to do their thing. I mean, poison projectiles, we have seen that it is entirely possible to rout some of Valinor's best units, and perhaps an extra shove, given the loss of the general, will be a very important thing. Shoal Runners. Sentinels of Tyrion on the way across me, so this is one position where Ulfang have been defeated. It's going to come down largely, I think, to the archers and the slingers. Although this is a pretty crass waste of ammunition. These Ravagers are already routing, and many of these shots are missing anyway. Mariners, so pretty decent victory over on this side of the field for Valinor. There's still some Ravagers, which are maintaining position, but elsewhere, in the middle, certainly Ulfang have been victorious, and over on this flank as well, you would suggest that with all of those shock infantry units on the way across, still being contested bitterly by Valinor, but and then come the Raiders as well. First example of a charge from them. They do manage to get their spears down. Sentinels of Tyrion not really taking a huge amount of losses, and of course shock infantry units in general are going to be good at dealing with cav in melee, and unlike the Knights of Tyrion, the Raiders do not have the same level of survivability, so unsurprisingly they get a lot of damage dealt to them at the hands of the Valinor swordsmen. They're also going to charge into the Marauders to prevent more throwing axes from finding their marks. Knights of Tyrion still roaming the field as well. Falx is drawn on the Raiders, but again this is going to be an engagement that they're outclassed in individually. Having a look, the battlefield is becoming smaller for Valinor. Mariners are routing off. I mean, all of these Falxmen still being kited backwards. This is not, I mean, considering the fact that withstanding range pressure is maybe not Ulfang's best trait. In both of the battles we've seen them in so far, they have been, well, basically on the receiving end of exactly the sort of thing that they're weak to, but they haven't folded as a result of that. At least not yet. Continued pressure at the hands of units like this will yield results in the long term for Valinor, however, but that's a good catch from Leech, managing to get his raiders into them and routing off the Shoal Hunters. And those Mariners are routing as well, so morale has actually been more of a problem for Valinor in this battle. The early loss of the general certainly not helping matters there. The Shoal Runners now charging in, and Thanes of Ulfang getting pretty far ahead of themselves, and surely as a result of that they are going to be routed. Blank shot, 49 of them wavering, cavalry all about them. Although we have seen so far, I mean, the Shoal Hunters do have armor-piercing attacks in melee, but perhaps that's not the most important trait to have when you're facing off against a force like Ulfang. Thanes. Rohatani Foragers in the background as well, so the advancing forward of the Grieving Sons and another unit of the Sentinels of Tyrion going after one of the final waves, really, of Ulfang, trying to prevent them from utilising their javelins, and that will, of course, be a relatively easy task. The Rohatani Foragers pretty poor in melee. Fangs of the Faithless still up on the hill, though. They're not the most damaging unit at range or in melee, but they have been able to get fairly consistent shots so far. It's the sort of thing which can really add up come the late game. And over yonder, Despoilers. Still 86 Sons of Ulfang. I mean, I think Valinor maybe missed a trick by not targeting the Sons of Ulfang down a little bit more earlier on. They were getting good hits off on the Despoilers, which is better than nothing, but the Sons of Ulfang were right there, and the armour piercing is such an important trait, especially considering all of Valinor's high-end units do have that really good armour score, and outside of the Sons of Ulfang, the House of Ulfang don't really have the most amount of armor piercing, which seems weird given their shock infantry focus, but that is the way it is. victory. Still the quality, I mean, if we get down to the nitty-gritty in the late game and it turns into small clutches of units facing off against one another, it's the sort of thing where you back Valinor 99 times out of 100 against their opponents today. As the battle becomes a little bit more easy to keep track of, let's go back up to regular speed. Valinor finally fall below half strength. Ulfang have been below half strength for a little while at this point, but I don't know. We haven't really seen Ulfang's morale start to collapse in a big way yet, but that is the sort of thing which maybe we'll see later. Yeah, managing to completely envelop what was left of that unit of Sentinels of Tyrion, but now they're in a big blob, and as a result you can see the slingers doing their thing. Not getting kills at a hugely quick rate, but again, all of this is adding up over time. Both sides have been on the receiving end of both shock damage and the kind of damage which is more of a slow burn. Still Valinor's archers doing their thing. Surely, at some point or another, Ulfang's weakness to all of these projectiles will probably start to come into play more. Sentries of Alcolonde. I think the Fangs of the Faithless have finally been engaged in the backfield here. The fact that there's still 24 Knights of Tyrion roaming around is probably a bad sign for Ulfang as well. Sentinels of Tyrion moving uphill. As we've said several times, Fangs of the Faithless are reasonably durable in melee, but they're not particularly good at dealing damage in melee. Which means I'd be very surprised if they got many kills against a unit of the caliber of the Sentinels of Tyrion, especially when they're taking continuous rear charges. Morale situation is probably looking a little bit dicey. But more and more we're starting to see less supporting units on the field, especially from Ulfang. Valinor still have their sentries dispersed throughout the field. Any semblance of order that this battle once had is now starting to unravel. Although I will say, Ulfang now occupy the side of the battlefield that Valinor did, and Valinor, as soon as the Fangs of the Faithless are dealt with, the opposite will be true as well, and that surely won't take too much longer. Grieving Sons still just about alive as well, 22 of them. Well, the announcer doesn't fancy Ulfang's chances, and the announcer in the last battle was a trustworthy source of information. And I will say, even if Ulfang do go on to lose this battle, in spite of the fact that they have lost both of their recent appearances on this channel, both times they've actually impressed me with how they've managed to deal with a situation that they're not really designed to be good in. Sentries of Alcolonde firing at point blank into some marauders. The Despoilers of Dorcaranthia are going to get in here, as well as the Raiders. That is going to rout off more of these units. Not the most important units to Valinor's chances of victory, but you need to find some way of really hammering home some kind of numbers advantage here if you're Ulfang. The Spoilers are there. There's still the small matter of 56 Sons of Ulfang, although you can see here that Mariners of Alcolonde trying to target them down. Cavalry moving across the field as well, and those Raiders of Dorcaranthia, there are only 7 of them, but they've actually done a very good job at routing off 25 Sentinels of Tyrion. Morale once again proving to be a very big factor in this battle. Both sides' cavalry doing the business here, but the loss of that general earlier on, the fact that Ulfang's general is still standing, has meant that they've actually been probably more mentally resilient than the Blessed Realm. But also, I mean, you kind of expect it here in this late stage, when a lot of the units that have been routed off are those more entry-level Teleri. Back come the Sentinels of Tyrion. I mean, I think the Ulfang general's kind of difficult to see. He doesn't really stand out that much. But you'd imagine, I think that's him, this guy here with the shield, who's in the Sons of Ulfang unit, and yeah, 45 of them. There's another unit of the Sons of Ulfang over there, but They're far more depleted. All of a sudden, looks like things may very well be turning around. It's not the first example we've seen either of people being gung-ho with their general. In the last battle, the House of Boar, while they did end up on the winning side, their attack effectively collapsed because they committed their general perhaps too early to the front line. There is more of a motivation in Silmarillion to preserve the life of your general and the unit that they're in until later, for that very purpose. Admittedly, in a more open field battle like this, that is a little bit more difficult to plan for, just because the enemy can force your hand a little bit, and perhaps Ulfang have been fortunate in the fact that their general has managed to keep himself alive. Even the Knights of Tyrion are shaken, though, at the hands of mere shock infantry, as Valinor once again try to reform themselves. If those Sentinels of Tyrion can prevent themselves from routing, with a little bit of support from the sentries and the shoal hunters, they should be just fine. But again, the fact there are still these raiders, I felt like they would be an important unit, but perhaps I felt it would be more of an early game unit for Ulfang to try and get some decisive early blows, but in the end it's actually been late in the game that they've been more important. Defeat seems almost certain. Fangs of the Faithless still here as well. Knights of Tyrion going after the Fangs of the Faithless, inflicting a few more hits on them. I can understand why they don't want to charge into the Sons of Ulfang. The reprisal damage will be very substantial, especially given the extra armour piercing, but again I think the assassination of the Ulfang general would pretty much result in their instantaneous collapse, and that would be enough to give Valinor the win. Whereas if you continue to bring it down to the wire like this, I mean, Sentinels of Tyrion versus Sons of Ulfang, a heavyweight clash in the making, but surely with the cavalry support being more substantial from Valinor, you'd expect Valinor to be able to heave themselves over the line here. Defeat seems certain. Surely that melee defense, but again, like the charge did land from the Sons of Ulfang, and that's why the Sentinels of Tyrion look so battered in comparison to what they were just moments ago. But I still think it's going to be those Knights of Tyrion which are the important factor here. They're not shock cavalry, so they're not going to do damage especially quickly, but the fact that there's still cavalry of that size this late on, in the background some despoilers of Dorcaranthia making their way over, very disparate Ulfang units. Sentinels of Tyrion running though, although having said that, it's very, very close this, with no infantry units left to speak of, and the fact that there are still plenty of Valksmen among the Ulfang units, relatively speaking anyway. Obviously these are very small units, but it's going to come down to whether or not these charges can do damage quickly enough to demolish these units, and also how many blows the Valksmen can land as well. I mean, also if the Knights of Tyrion rout, that's all that Valinor have left. So this has proven to be a very, very close 1v1 indeed. Still those raiders. I mean, if they try and engage against the Knights, it's not going to end too well for them, but forming a blob thick enough that the Knights can't simply run them down quickly is the problem here, and there's not really much that Valinor can do at this stage now that Ulfang have managed to regroup, purely because they don't have any infantry units to try and force the issue at all. They're going after some of the weaker targets first. 11 Sons of Ulfang, charge being landed. Hit and run. Ooh, they actually do still have throwing axes. Any hit landed will be vital. The general still lives. Somewhere? I think the general's still alive. Yeah, that's him, isn't it? Maybe? Maybe it wasn't the guy with the shield, maybe it's him. The unhelmeted Son of Ulfang. And that's going to be it, surely. Knights of Tyrion don't have the heft anymore to be able to charge into and deal with these Valksmen, so it's going to be a victory for Ulfang. A very impressive victory as well. I mean, Valinor, as far as quality goes, obviously, are at the bleeding edge of what Silmarillion has. Though I do think that you do see the downside of Valinor in a situation like this, where the battlefield can be made a little bit bigger. Even though they inflicted a lot of damage on Ulfang on the approach and continued to do so throughout the battle. The numbers are still a concern, although to be fair, the numbers discrepancy wasn't huge. The Teleri were here in fairly high numbers, so they didn't surrender the numbers game too heavily to Ulfang. You know, as Valinor, you're always going to have smaller armies, but it wasn't as if they were completely overmatched in that regard. But you can see, based on the number of kills, what the problem was, and it was the loss of that general. It was routing, weirdly enough, for Valinor, which is perhaps a rare enough thing, but it shows how important trying to keep your general alive is. Like I said, in a 1v1, in a more open battle like this, that can be the sort of thing which comes down to good fortune more than anything else. So the Sons of Ulfang, where the Ulfang general was, were in melee for quite some time, and the general did not fall, whereas the Valinor general was in melee for not a huge amount of time, and obviously the RNG of battle being what it is, he fell. An unfortunate blow struck, and I think it does showcase, I think, the importance of the general, this battle, more so than anything else, more so than anything about Valinor as a faction or even Ulfang as a faction. I think that the importance of the general was the main thing about this battle. As far as Ulfang themselves go, I think over the course of the last two Silmarillion battles, both in a large-scale siege situation and in a 1v1 pitch situation like this, they've acquitted themselves really very well. A loss and a victory on both separate occasions, but I think the shock infantry focus of them is maybe a little bit more challenging. You know, it's not the easiest kind of unit to wield, especially when you consider that the counter to that is fairly obvious. If you can dominate them at range and do damage quickly with ranged units, Ulfang are going to struggle a little bit, and perhaps they don't have the same guerrilla warfare advantages that the likes of the Haladin, Assyrian, and the Avari do. They're able to, of course, rely on hidden units a little bit more, whereas it doesn't seem that Ulfang can do that, in spite of being maybe a little bit fragile in the same kind of ways. But I think that you also saw the advantages of Ulfang being aggressive on this occasion. They were able to really take the fight to one of the scariest forces that you can face in the game, and they were not found wanting. So there you go. Let's see what did the damage. Of course, the Ulfang kill counts are going to be relatively low because of the nature of the force they were facing off against. Raiders of Dor Caranthea are getting over 100 kills though, so that cavalry, it really did into the late game prove to be very, very important, because you could see that units were routing as a result of them charging in, and of course that feeds back into the loss of the general. The Thanes of Ulfang did very well in the middle as well. They managed to get in and amongst and disrupt the phalanx of the Plaza Guardians. Very important, of course. Sons of Ulfang, 57 kills. That's, again, it may seem relatively low, but when you consider the fact that they were going up against fairly consistently units like the Sentinels of Tyrion, all of those kills pretty much were going to be of high quality. Maybe a few Alqualonde archers found their way in there as well. Fangs of the Faithless, one shy of 100 kills as well. So again, that slow burn kind of damage that they were doing, they lasted a fair while, and indeed, you know, right towards the end, they were actually still a factor in melee, which, considering they were getting cycle charged and hit by Tyrion swordsmen, that does go to showcase their durability, if nothing else. So yeah, big thank you to Leech for sending this one to me. Obviously good to show off some of the changes in Silmarillion once again. I don't know, based on when this battle's coming out, I think I'm going to have to be prioritising the Saturday ones, because there's a very real chance that in August I'll be away for 3 weeks once again. But yeah, so I think the midweek battles from this point onwards, I think for at least 2 weeks, will probably not be happening. But again, it's more me anticipating something that may or may not be. So you know, that's by the by, really. If I can record some more in the interim, then I will. But we'll just have to wait and see on that one, won't we? Anyway, big thank you to Leech and to Batu for recording this battle and allowing me to showcase it. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.